And during the Trump presidency, I think lots of scientists were inclined to take sides, and
yeah, for sure.
I think we can understand. But the consequence of that is that then they can get labeled as one group, and so what means that is their voices, when they try to say something which has to reach all the population, is going to you're going to convince the people who don't need to be convinced, because they're already in your camp and say yes, yes, yes. And then when you try to reach out, people says, well, we know who you are from the other camp. And so I think key thing is to try really to reach, not to make it not to score political points. I mean, climate change is too important. It's not to engage in the next political election to say that this candidate is bad. I think the scientists should really try to reach everybody, because in the long term, everybody, even people we individually can disagree politically with, everybody we have a collective shared interest into the world, not going too bad too quickly. So that's the thing I think to try really to reach out to the people who are skeptical in a neutral way.
I'm joined by Lionel Page, who's a professor of economics and the director of the Behavioural and Economic Science Cluster at the University of Queensland. Lionel's research explores behavioural economics, game theory, econometrics, and its intersection with the behavioural sciences. Lionel is also the author of Optimally Irrational: The Good Reasons We Behave the Way We Do. So thank you for joining me, Lionel.
Well, thank you very much, Xavier, for the invitation.
No, absolutely. Look, I thought we would start off with a little bit of a story. So there's all sorts of interesting stories related to cognitive bias, irrationality, these sort of fields that you study regarding the behavioral sciences. And there's quite an interesting and perhaps overdone story about the sociologist Leon Festinger, who essentially he claimed he infiltrated a conspiracy group and was able to join this group who believed that they had been in contact with like a godlike figure, and that godlike figure claimed that the world would come to an end. And so after following this cult for a while and infiltrating it, they said that there would be a day of reckoning where essentially on midnight on this day, God is going to come down, and because we're believers, is going to save all of us, but the rest of the world is going to be doomed. And so what ended up happening is what you would think, which is obvious, is that the end of the world didn't happen, not surprisingly. But the views of the people within the cult did not change. And the reason they did not change is because they claimed, because they were such good believers or something along those lines, that God had actually saved them. And essentially their belief in this cult perpetuated. It did not change. And so shifting the evidence to meet their foundational beliefs in this God figure. I sort of tell this story as an example of irrationality, or perhaps it's not irrationality, we'll find out. But I wanted to get a bit of sense about, your research is in the behavioral sciences and economics. Lionel, could you tell me a bit about how you got interested in this field, what your story is, and sort of how it connects to stories like I just told?
Well, hopefully, my story doesn't belong to the story of people belonging to this kind of cults who don't change their mind. My personal story, I was a student in economics, and when I was a student, I did economics and social sciences as a student, and that was very interesting. But I guess I was a bit critical. I mean, having been exposed broadly to other sciences like history, sociology, philosophy. I mean, philosophy is not a science, but it gives you another outlook. I was a bit unsatisfied, like many in my generation, with the old-styled economics, which is sometimes called neoclassical economics, where economists were assuming that people are really good at making decisions. But a bit, when I say really good, maybe it's not so much that they are really good, but they're a bit like computers. So we were thinking of people as computers, or maybe a better image would be that if you were to think about what kind of people economists were considering when looking at decisions, they were looking at somebody like Mr. Spock in Star Trek. That is somebody very rational, a bit like thinking like a computer, very emotionless, not a bad person. You know, Mr. Spock is not a bad person, but you feel that there's a lot of layers of psychological layers, social layers of personality, of what makes us human, which we're missing. And so I was as a student at the time, and I was a bit unsatisfied with that. And I happened to follow a very interesting course on decision making under risk and uncertainty. And it was one of the courses where there was really economics where looked like a science. That is, you had theories, you had experiments where we were looking whether people were following the theory. The experiments usually were a bit negative, so we were saying no, actually people don't behave like the theory predicts. And so there were new theories proposed to try to explain how people are behaving and why they're behaving the way they do. And then there were new experiments and often new contradictions. And when you looked at this, really you had the feeling that economics was progressing as a science. And that was very interesting. I mean, I had very much of a different experience working in this field than the experience of a student, where usually, it's very top down when you do undergrad or even early graduate school, and you're told that's economics, that's the way you do. And sometimes you have questions, you think, well, that's very strange, because this kind of theory about economics doesn't look like the real world. It looks very different, and maybe we're missing something. But you, as a student, as an undergrad, you don't have the background really to understand the problem exactly, but also you're not given much freedom to think. You have first to acquire the discipline, the knowledge from the discipline, the way it is conveyed. But when I moved to graduate school and then I was exposed to this kind of research, I really liked it. And that was the entry points to behavioral sciences, because basically this was really an entry points to behavioral economics. Behavioral economics being this area where you have psychologists and economists who have been working together, investigating the economic theories, making new theories, testing theories in experiment. Typically, you ask people to make decisions and you see whether people behave the way the theory predicts. And if the theory doesn't work, well, you try to find better theories. And so that experience was really quite fulfilling when you're a young scientist. You think, I'm not just following this kind of maybe the kind of cult with the principles of you have to always stick to it. You can revise your beliefs, you can look for new ideas, and that was quite exciting. So that's my personal entry points to behavioral science.
Absolutely. I couldn't agree more that, once you're exposed to ideas about behavioral sciences like psychology, when you first come across cognitive bias, at least for me, it was like a new world had opened. And it also served as quite a useful tool and providing another lens of viewing the world, especially through economics, where I think you're taught in very first year economics that, people are rational actors. People don't make irrational decisions, and it's only until behavioral economics came along where that view was sort of upended. But to focus on that point, for all of those people who are perhaps left-brained, I think mind one, as Daniel Kahneman said, I can't quite remember what the theory is, but people that think of themselves as Spock-like logical thinkers. What would you have to say to them about the evidence about what behavioral sciences does to economics and how it sort of shows that this may not necessarily be the case? What would you say to people that are a bit skeptical?
So by that, you mean that you think some people are skeptical because they think they're very rational, and so that doesn't apply? I'm not sure people would reasonably agree with the fact that they're very rational. Most people, because Mr. Spock, I don't think many people would see Mr. Spock and say, yeah, that's it. That's the kind of person I am. our human experience is characterized by a wide range of feelings and emotions, and which widely differ from this Mr. Spock model. We fall in love, we get angry, we have gut feelings, and that's just one of the few things. I mean, you have also like very strong social feelings, things like when you go and watch a football or a sports event, or even a religious event, and you feel like you're part of the crowd, and you get this feeling of elation of, if maybe your team win, or maybe you're singing in a church, and you get this feeling of sharing a collective event with other people, or you have this feeling of willing to be able to help other people. Like you see some people, you see natural disaster, and right away you feel empathy and bad feeling, even if this disaster is happening very far away. You may go online and decide to give some money for people with whom you are very unrelated. And I think most people would recognize themselves in having this kind of emotions, and that is kind of normal. The kind of Spock, very cold and rational, is not necessarily, I don't think it's really a role model. And that's why people from my generation, once we were exposed to the ideas from psychology, the idea that we can investigate actual human beings instead of sticking to a very abstract model like Mr. Spock, we wanted to look at it, because that's the way we are, right? So we are missing something if we just assume we're rational. So I don't think my answer, maybe that's not the answer you wanted, but I'm not sure. Lots of people said they are super rational. And I think if they tell you that, I think you can really ask them, have they never felt strong emotions like love, hate, anger, shame, all these kind of things, which we can. So we can talk about it afterwards. We can explain it. I mean, now we have a much better understanding about what's happening, and part of it in my book Optimally Irrational is to explain why there are very good reasons why we have these emotions. They don't make us bad decision makers. If anything, they make us better decision makers. And if I want to continue the metaphor, I mean, in the Star Trek series, the classical one from the 70s, I mean, Mr. Spock is officially at face value, he's the most rational, but often in the series, they show that he's missing some aspects of reality that the kind of allegedly imperfect human with the Captain Kirk, right, is capturing better, because in spite of his imperfection, in a way, Spock, he's seeing things or feeling things that Spock is kind of alien to. And so our emotions are here for a reason. They make us better at doing what we have to do, at working with other people, being willing to cooperate with other people, etc., etc. And so that's we're not rational like the old economic models, but it doesn't mean that the way we are is wrong.
Absolutely. And on that note of emotions, I think it's a common straw man or a potential argument that people make that if they are, let's say there's a debate team and one person is getting quite visibly upset or annoyed at the point that the opposition team is making, a common retort or a common objection as well, look at the opponent, they're now getting upset because they're not making they're not, because they can't refute what I'm saying, they're getting upset. That's sort of a common, I would say, rebuttal, at least what I've seen in terms of like rhetorical tactics. So, and you made the point earlier that emotions in a sense actually can make you more rational. So what do you mean by that? And could you explore that a bit?
Yeah, I mean, emotions, I think you can think about several types of emotions. One type of emotions are the kind of good feelings that you have, feeling good or bad about some things, even if you can't really put kind of reason about it. Let's imagine, you are, you move to a new university, you're going to start to study in a new university, you have to move, you have to look for a flat in a city. And so you visit a few flats, and on one morning you visit one flat, and very quickly you have to decide whether you want to say that you want the flat or not. surely part of your decision making is going to be that you look for specific things and you can reason about it. But part of your decision making is going to be a gut feeling. You feel that it looks good, you feel good about the place, or inversely, you don't feel good about it. And I think it is said that, in this kind of situation, people are able to make their mind almost in a few minutes. And when you think about all of these emotions, these gut feelings, a view from before would be that these gut feelings, they are kind of, not rational, well-shaped ideas, and so that you're going to be influenced by wrong things. But a more modern view of these emotions, informed from modern cognitive science, modern neuroscience, is to think that as you enter this flat, your brain is going to process a lot of information. You are going to pick up things like whether the light is good. Already before entering, you had looked at whether the neighborhood is safe, how far it is from amenities and from the train station, et cetera, et cetera. And all these, even if you don't have to have a little voice in your head thinking about, like talking a lot, saying, yeah, that's great. These accumulates in terms of positives or negative feelings. And so these feelings, these gut feelings, you can think of it as your brain having processed a lot of information and giving value to it and sending you a signal. You can think of that, the little voice in your head, as being the CEO of a big company. And how does the CEO makes a decision? Well, the CEO is asking his or her advisors, what is the best thing to do? And the CEO, he gets reports about, the decision on this aspect is good, the decision on this aspect is dangerous. And in a way, the different brain processes which analyze the information you're getting from visiting are giving you this feeling. So, you get a feeling for the safety of the neighborhood. You get a feeling for how much lightning there is in the lighting there is in the room. You get a feeling for the space. You get a feeling maybe if the door is creaking. And all these feelings accumulate to give you an overall feeling, which helps you make a decision. And if these feelings overwhelmingly go in one direction, then your decision is made. You don't need to think about it. Like if I was to ask you, what do you think? It's like, oh, no, I don't like it. And it's only when, these feelings are going to be ambiguous because there is some positive aspects and some negative aspects that you find hard to make a decision. And then maybe you're going to be starting to be, thinking, oh, okay, let me think about it. It's a difficult decision, etc. So these emotions, they are not, in that view, these emotions are not something which are polluting, which is noise polluting your decision. They are really the background treatment of information from your brain, which picks up a lot of things, and very likely in a very efficient way. That is, it picks up from your memory, match what you see now with your past experience, which was positive or negative, to help you make a decision now. So that's the first type of emotions that we have, these gut feelings. There is another type of emotions which are social emotions, like love and anger. And these we now have very good understanding about why it's likely that they help you make decisions in social interactions. So one thing that you face often in social interactions is that having too many options is a disadvantage. So it's a kind of a puzzle. It's called the commitment paradox, or the commitment problem. If you have too many options, in particular, if you have exit options, then people knowing that you have exit options can take advantage of that by pushing you and knowing that, maybe you will choose your exit options and that's going to benefit them. And so one strategic solution to avoid that is to remove your exit option. So you have famous examples. You're a general arriving with your army in a new country, and what do? You burn your ships. You tell everybody, we're not going back. So there's no exit option. We're only going forward, or you burn the bridge behind you. And similarly, some of these emotions can help you actually remove some of your options, which makes you more convincing in social interaction. So anger is a perfect example. We may think the first reactions when we think about anger is, why would we be angry? I mean, it seems like a very bad thing. Often people make a lot of mistakes when they're angry. They do things that they regret eventually. So it looks like a very bad idea of being angry. But now let's think about something else. Let's think about, situations where you've got a bully he's bigger than you, and every, you're at school, and every lunchtime he comes and picks up your sandwich. So now the problem is that because your exit option is not to do anything, and to accept and to try to avoid him as possible, and you could, on the contrary, you could fight. You could say, but if you fight, the problem is that it's very costly, and you're going likely to be to lose. So because the bully knows that you have an exit option, which is to avoid conflict, he can come every day and do that to you every day. Now imagine that, instead of having this, you have very strong emotions like anger, which in spite of the risk of, fighting back, would lead you to reject absolutely the idea of being bullied, and you're willing to take the risk and to say no and to be conflictual. Well, in that case, if the bully knows that's the case, that you can get angry and then you may retaliate. Even if you would win in a fight, he may think twice, because he may think, okay, I would win, but then, it's not anymore a cheap sandwich I'm getting. It's a sandwich plus a fight, and who knows what can happen. It's not as a nice option. And so as a consequence, the bully may decide to leave you in peace. And so this strong emotion of anger, if it makes you credible it makes credible that you would potentially retaliate, even if it's a bad idea, in the sense that you could get injured or something like that. It can increase your ability to convince others, and in this case, this bully, to leave you in peace. And so these emotions, there's emotions like love, anger, and shame, and for instance, they can help you remove some of these options that you have in social interactions, and as a consequence, they make you better at interacting with other people.
Yeah, absolutely. So if I was just to summarize those 2 points, so the first point being gut feelings or gut reactions, you would say that gut feeling is essentially a reflection of a huge amount of data that you're processing within a few seconds. And so to discredit it by saying, well, it's just a feeling, it's not based on any empirical sort of blah, 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 the counter would be, well, your brain is an incredibly powerful tool. And to sort of second guess that is not only is it perhaps maybe simplistic, but it's also discounting the evolutionary tools that we have been built with. And then social emotions, well, I mean, perhaps at times they can lead you in bad places, but you would say overall they encourage and influence decision making in like an optimal way, would you say?
Yes, and one of the, it's hard to explain it in very quickly, but the key intuition here is that you have this paradox of commitment, which means that sometimes being overly rational can be detrimental in social interactions. So, if I know that you are very rational, then I can push you a bit, because I know that, retaliating may be too costly for you. So I can push you a bit and take advantage of that. I know that you're not, if I know that I'm playing with Mr. Spock, well, maybe I can take a chunk of his sandwich, because he's not going to start to put a fight for me taking a chunk of his sandwich. But because of that, every day maybe I'm able to take a chunk of his sandwich just below, the situation where he thinks it's worth fighting. Now, if instead of being against Mr. Spock, I'm against Captain Kirk, that's a bit different, because now, who knows, maybe he's going to get angry. And if I take any piece of his sandwich, he'll says, what are you doing? That's my sandwich. And he may have a reaction which is disproportionate relative to what it is, because maybe it's just a piece of sandwich. But once I know that he would react in a disproportionate way, which may seem irrational, I will not pick anymore a bit of his sandwich. So, in what economists we talk equilibrium, that is, in what's going to happen, me knowing that he would react disproportionately, I'm not going to try to do anything to him. And then, so anger will not need to be activated. So you have this kind of thing, anger, in a way, it's great that we have it, and that most often we don't need to activate it. We don't need to be angry, because people know that if they were doing stuff bad to us, we would get angry. And so it's only in rare situations where, people disagree or people make mistakes that people get angry. But in most situations, like, we don't need to get angry, because people anticipate that if they were doing some stuff to us, even minute things, we would get angry at obviously different levels. of anger. But that's the way it works. So, you know, it's when we see people getting angry and doing things a bit over the top, it may seem strange, but in a way we are out of equilibrium in these kind of situations. That is, we don't see that the benefits of anger are all the benefits that we get from all the situations that are not happening. You know, people not pushing, the fact that we're not pushovers means that we get a lot of benefit from that.
Definitely. And so, I mean, a question I'd be wondering is, so in terms of using emotions to stick on anger, for example, let's say in this situation, to not show your anger would be a mistake, would you say? Because you're sort of fighting against the inherent feeling that may be quote unquote rational in that moment, right? So if a bully, like you feel angry to be bullied, right? And so to demonstrate that emotion would be rational. But I also see how that can quickly slip into putting yourself in a bad position. So is the nuance that it may be rational, but it may not be the best decision, or what's the...
Look, that's an excellent question. You know, one of the convincing facts which show that, you know, this tragic role of emotions is the fact that our propensity to feel this emotion is actually not absolute. It's going to depend on the tragic situation. And I think you'll understand this very well if I change my bully example with, you know, you have like in the bully example, the bully is very strong. So the bully would most likely beat you in a fight. But if somebody who is, you know, smaller than you tried to get your sandwich, you know, and maybe he managed to grab your sandwich, start to take a bite, well, you may feel angry. And what we find is that people get much more angry in situations where they would be more likely to win. So, you know, if in a way, the bigger the bully, the least angry you'll feel. It's not that you're trying not to feel angry. You may still feel angry, but even the kind of natural emotion that you're going to feel is kind of calibrated to the situation, because it would be a bad idea of, you know, you've got somebody who is like, who's just out of prison, with very tall, very muscly, and repeated for being very violent, and it takes your sandwich and you get really mad, you know. Maybe that's not the best situation to get angry. And so research has shown that men in particular get more angry against other men in situations where physically, you know, they're all the same size, and they're less angry if they face a potentially larger opponent. But similarly, you know, these emotions, the idea here is that these emotions, they help you navigate these social interactions to get an advantage. And so if you were overly angry against somebody who was too strong, that would not be good. You have other situations where you may want to kind of rationally mitigate your feelings. And potentially here is that you know, our feelings may not always be calibrated for the kind of situation we face in the real world. So it is very likely that the type of emotions we feel have been kind of designed by evolution over time for us to be very good at some specific type of interactions. And we are now thrown into very different types of situations often than our ancestors. So an example, for instance, is that if you were to take a time machine and go back in time, like, you know, 3,000 or 10,000 years ago, you see that most humanity was living in very small communities. There was a level of violence which people often really do not realize. That is, there was like, it's easy to have something like 30% of people commit murder or are the victim of a murder in their lifetime in these times. And so having very strong emotions, potentially, we have to think like the emotion of anger, for instance, is very important in situations for people not to take advantage of you, but also the level of these emotions may be quite high to kind of prompt you to engage in this kind of violence acts which are going to deter other people. And then you take these kind of emotions and you throw us in kind of very much more peaceful environment in modern organizations. And then, you know, that's your colleague who should have sent your report at midnight it's very important for your promotion. And instead of that, he played all night video game. And when you talk to him in the next morning, he says, "Oh, sorry, I've not done it." If you get angry, the kind of emotion that you may feel may not be well calibrated to the kind of situations where we are in a peaceful environment where people are going to collaborate over a long time. So in that case, that's one reason maybe where you should kind of try to manage your anger, not to burn your bridges for people you're not going to enter in a physical warfare with people most often. So you have to work out these agreements, and we still have these emotions which may not be ideally suited for these new, more peaceful environments.
Yeah, so just to summarize in addressing the question, so there may be a slight mismatch in terms of the degree to which we feel things and how to actually respond to them, but that doesn't necessarily mean we need to discount how we feel overall just because they are very relevant to our evolutionary past. So I mean, this takes this is a good segue so into our next question. So we had recently Professor Ben Newell, the professor of cognitive psychology at UNSW, on the podcast, and he basically said one of the key takeaways is that our everything that we do in terms of how we think about things in regards to cognitive bias explicitly is a result of our evolutionary past. So we have been essentially via natural selection, we have evolved in such a way that has allowed us to have these inbuilt biases. And we talked a little bit about that, but the title of your book is Optimally Irrational, which to me, it sounds like the suggestion is perhaps there's a healthy amount of irrationality, which makes us the best versions of ourselves. So could you go into a bit more detail of what it means to be optimally irrational, and how does that link with evolutionary biology?
Yeah, well, it's Ben is obviously totally right that everything which characterizes us, and not just us, any animal on the planet is the result of evolution, and of all the problems that our ancestors who were successful. Richard Dawkins said something very insightful, that we have to realize how, we are, if we're here alive, it means that we are the descendant of a line of all successful ancestors in a world which is not very charitable, where they had to survive finding food and resources, finding a mate, and avoiding being killed in wars, etc. So and it's not just human ancestors, primate ancestors, mammals, etc. So we are the product of this long line of people and organisms having to make decisions and made the right decisions. And so that's how our psychological traits or decision mechanisms have been selected. So now, in the book, I take this view to try to I'm rejecting a bit, in a way, the typical way behavioral economics has been presented. If you were to ask people what is behavioral economics, I think the standard answer is, well, we study the fact that people are irrational, they make mistakes, they don't behave like in the old classical model, like Mr. Spock. And it is totally true that behavioral economics, as I said, add layers of psychology, interesting psychology beyond the Mr. Spock model, which was the old economic model. But I think that characterizing behavioral economics as the fact that we find that people are irrational I don't think it's the best way of doing it. I mean, it's true that people make mistakes, and some of the reasons are the kind of mismatch that we already mentioned, mismatch between the reasons or the way we've been selected by evolution and the new environment we're facing. But often, a lot of what we call biases are actually good solutions to the problem we face. And when there is a risk when you're a behavioral scientist, looking at something that some people do strange things, and if you don't understand them, you say it's a bias. I mean, well, okay, it's a real question here. Is it a bias, or is it that your model about what people should do is wrong? So you need to be really convinced that your model is the right one, that you understand exactly the kind of problem people are facing, that people are trying to answer, to label what they are doing as wrong. And the risk is that you go to a situation and people are facing a specific type of problems that they understand pretty well, and they're trying to do the best. And the behavioral scientist doesn't consider all what's happening in the situation, all the layers of complexity. And as a consequence, the behavioral scientists, label this kind of behavior irrational. So in the book, I show that, in a way, we should have much more faith into the fact that we are pretty good at making decisions because we've been selected by evolutions, and often a lot of the biases are actually good solutions. So I could give you two examples. Maybe
please do.
I'll start with anybody who has worked or looked a bit at behavioral economics know the prospect theory utility function, the fact that people care about gains and losses, and so your subjective satisfaction follows a kind of S shape. So relative to a reference point, you enjoy getting gains, you feel like great having wins, but the first gains are those who brings you the most subjective satisfaction, and then it decreases over time. And then for losses, it's the same thing. You don't like losses, but the first loss are the most painful ones. And then as you get more and more losses, you feel less and less about these additional losses. So you have subjective satisfaction, which follow an S shape centered around 0, which is your reference point. And this has typically been considered as a bias, as a kind of, why would you have this reference point? It leads to some behavioral patterns which looks wrong, etc., etc. Now, if you think about what is subjective satisfaction? Let's try to ask a question. Could this be a good way of making decisions or of having this kind of subjective satisfaction? Well, subjective satisfaction, you can really think of it as a way for you to help you make good decisions. It's a kind of signal. It's an information telling you that decision is good, continue doing it, or that decision is bad, bad, negative satisfaction, don't do it. So you feel positive satisfaction when you take a good coffee in the morning, when your friends write to you and say, it's great, I want to see you, when you experience positive things, these are positive situations that are good for you. So you should try to go toward them. And you feel negative satisfactions for things like, putting your hand on the hot stove, your girlfriend saying, sorry, I'm breaking up with you, all these things are bad. And so give you negative satisfaction. So now if you think about that, how should this subjective satisfaction work? Well, you only need two things to have this kind of S shape, like the prospect theory. And they are very credible things. One thing is that your brain is a limited system with a limited number of neurons who can fire a limited amount of times. So basically, if satisfaction is kind of an information about how good the situation is likely to be, it's a signal. This signal, it cannot go from minus infinity to plus infinity. It has to be bounded in a way. If you have neurons firing saying that's great, there's a limited number. There may be millions of neurons, but there's a limited number of neurons who can fire and say it's great. So you have a situation when you have the maximum happiness, maximum satisfaction you can feel is when, let's say, all your neurons dedicated to measure this subjective satisfaction are firing as fast as they can, saying that's great. Maybe your team win the World Cup, football World Cup. That's at that moment, everything is firing up. You're super happy. And on the contrary, if everything is bad, all these neurons are low activity, and so you feel very bad. So you have these bounds. Minimum satisfaction, maximum satisfaction. Then you just need another thing, which is that our perception is imperfect. So, if I give you two pens and I tell you which pen is heaviest, you may struggle because their weight is the same. I mean, maybe if you put them in a balance, which is like very, very precise, you'll find that one is heavier than the other. But your perception is not as precise. So you'll struggle. You'll be like, I don't know, they feel the same. And similarly, if I give you two options which are very close in characteristics, you may feel like, you don't know. I tell you, do you want do you want this to live in this flat or this flat? And they are pretty similar in characteristics. You may be, I'm not sure. Okay. So because you have this imprecision, you would want your subjective satisfaction to be more discriminating in the cases which are in the situations that you're the most likely to encounter. And a very simple consequence of that is that this subjective satisfaction should not be like a line between minimum and maximum, but it should be steeper, because that allows you to make to feel bigger differences between the options that you consider. And it should be steeper in the range of outcomes that you're most likely going to face. So, if most of the day, for instance, like let's say you're a punter, and most of the day you're a punter gambling $100, then to choose between the gambles you're making, you should have the right feelings when you're considering gambles with $100. And so your utility function should be very steep. Your subjective satisfaction should be very steep for you to feel that this gamble is much better than this one, around $100. Apart from that, if I was to come and tell you, do you want these two gambles and they involve millions of dollars, they may feel a bit the same because they're way out of your range. Okay. And if I was to present you gambles about 10 cents, once again, you may feel a bit the same because they're out of your range. And so your utility function would have this A shape, and that would be the optimal way for you to make a decision. It would be flat in the kind of situations that you don't encounter, the gambles with $1 million or the gamble with 10 cents, and it would be steep in the situations that you're encountering, gambles with $100. So that's the first example where this thing like the A-shaped utility function, which has been thought as being marker for irrationality, once you just understand the kind of physical constraint that our brain faces when making decision, it then emerged naturally as an optimal solution.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So, I mean, just to summarize it all, essentially, in one context, what is considered a bias in a completely different context could be considered an advantage, an evolutionary advantage. So, in the context of our brain chemistry, or perhaps energy, we have a limited amount of energy, and we also have a limited amount of neurons. So there's only so much we can do with the limited amount of neurons we can do. So what we've evolved to do is have the first loss and the first gain to be the strongest that we feel, to reflect these limitations, which it seems so incredible when you put it in that context, that it's a resolution to a very hard problem.
It's a resolution to a very hard problem. And you rightly said it, I think. You said you react to your first gains and first loss. And it makes sense, because you should be sensitive around where you are now, because that's where you're likely to make decisions when you observe are you going up or you're going down relative to where you are now. So you should be sensitive to that. It allows you to make good decisions. If I was to tell you, for instance, do you want to have a gambles where one you can win $5 million, another one you can gain $6 million, they may feel now a bit the same, because we typically wouldn't have that much money. But if you were somebody working in a hedge fund, right, where you handle millions of dollars all the time, then that you may feel very different about that, because then your utility function would be calibrated to make the decision in this range.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think intuitively, we all, at least from me speaking, so for example, maybe losing money. And so let's say you have there's 1 week where you go to the bars and you accidentally spend too much money, and you think, oh my God, I've spent way too much, and my budget doesn't accommodate for this. Then the next week you do it, you're like, oh, well, I mean, I've done it last week, so I mean, it doesn't feel as bad. I don't know, maybe I'm just making something up, but that's how I'm sort of viewing what you're saying. And perhaps slightly different, but I think is related to optimal inattention. So I saw that you were giving a presentation and you used this term. So essentially, in the context of focusing on anything, focusing on a task, our brain can only focus so much energy on a specific task, and it makes sense, right? Because we have limited neurons, limited energy. So I think there's the video that everyone has seen where there's a gorilla that
Right.
walks in the middle of
Yeah.
a team playing basketball, and if you're focused, and the objective is count the amount of times the ball's passed,
Yeah.
and you will never see the gorilla, right? Which I think everyone has seen. But I think this is also a good example of a similar concept, which is saying that it's a bias, yes. However, it is a solution to a really difficult problem.
Exactly. You're totally right. So I said I would give you two examples, and I can take this one as a second example. Indeed, I think it is we have a wrong impression about the fact that our brain is kind of tricking us into thinking that we observe the world as it is. The one very obvious way of seeing that's not the case, that we have the optic nerve at the back of our eye kind of obstruct one small area of our eye when you can't see. So actually, in terms of stimulus, visual stimulus that you get from the external world, there is a black patch without stimulus that you do not get from the outside world. And you can see, you can find online experiments when you can actually see that by moving a letter, for instance, like that, you stop and you don't see the letter anymore, right? And so there's this patch where you do not get visual inputs. And what happens is that your brain fill the gap. Your brain doesn't tell you, you don't hang up around with like, a dark patch saying, you don't see here, you don't know what's going on here. Your brain says, everything is fine, I'm filling the gap. It's like an AI filter, filling the gap, looking at doing the photoshopping live. And what happens is that with your saccades of your eyes, you have enough information to kind of fill the gap, to use the past information to, assume that if the world does not change in this area since the last half a second, and then your brain pretends that you see the world as it is, but you don't see the world as it is. That's one obvious thing with this your optical nerve. But when you think about a more fundamental thing, is that consider when you take a digital camera and you take a movie of your kid playing football on the football pitch. And you take 10 seconds and you say, I'm going to send the video to grandma, and you look at it. Oh, it's 50 meg. It's 10 seconds on your camera. It's 50 meg when you have the video and you have the sound. Think about the amount of information just flowing in your brain at any seconds. The information coming from the outside world in terms of the visual input, the sound input, etc. And your camera is not even processing the information to make decisions. The camera is not thinking, should I send it to grandma? You're the one thinking that. So you have to live in a world with a stream of data, incredible amount of information all the time. And you need to process this information to understand what's happening and what should I do. So now your brain is very efficient. It only works on 20 watts. And it's an amazingly efficient, when you think about the decision it's making, and which can now work with very complex computers. And they do some things like playing chess or doing mathematics much better than our brain. But, until now, like we start having AI when you can chat and they start looking a bit human, but they are pretty poor in social situations, right? Social situations, making decisions, etc. It's very complex. And so your brain is excellent at doing that. But how does it do it? In the flow of information that you're getting, you need to optimize how you process information. So you have all this information, but only a fraction of this information that you're getting is relevant to make a decision. Okay. So, when I take a movie of my kid playing football or football pitch, there's plenty of information which is not relevant. First, maybe I care about my kid. So, if there's another kid and the past of the other kid is not good, maybe it doesn't matter too much to me. So I'm going to focus on my kid, and, something on my kid are not even relevant. Maybe, he's not put a button properly on his shirt, but that's not a relevant information. So I can ignore a lot of information, and my brain is going to do that. And so optimal inattention, and the example you gave of the gorilla, it's an excellent demonstration of that. That is, you had this experiment with people in white and people in black, and the psychologist says, well, people are going to move back to play basketball, and you need to count the passes in the white team. So when you have people with white t-shirt, they pass basketball, and you're counting. And so you have one goal. When you see this visual stream of information, your brain has only one goal. get the ball, the number of passes right. So you focus because you think that's the key thing in the experiment. And when there's a guy dressed as a gorilla moving in the background, thumping his chest in the middle of everybody and moving away, it's indeed, I think 2/3 of people on average say that they didn't see it. But is it a bias? Well, I think it's a trick. It's a trick which kind of, create a very unusual situation where the fact that our brain is optimized to really make the best decision by minimizing the information content that is extracted from reality to focus on what's relevant to make the decision. Obviously, the psychologist has created a situation when there's something obviously totally unlikely that a gorilla is going to move. And so we're not, and also by telling you, you have to focus on this stuff. And so we're not designed to see that. And it shows how our brain works. But that's not a mistake. That's actually a reflection about how good, how optimized our brain is to focus on the very thin slice of reality to make decisions.
Absolutely. Absolutely. There's so many good questions to ask now. With everything in mind that we've been speaking about how biases in one context is an advantage in another context, for me, this is quite stimulating, especially in the context of big problems, so like climate change. So what Ben Newell said last time, if he had the power to change humans in a positive way to reflect behavioral science, one of the things that he said is he would try and make people more future oriented, given the problems that like climate change pose a huge risk to future peoples, right? So to me, this bias in conjunction with problems like climate change is quite, given the context that you've just laid out, sounds very, very challenging, because we've evolved to be one way, and there's going to be problems that are in our evolutionary blind spot, so to speak. So trying to get together all 193 countries aiming towards a specific goal in conjunction with the complexity of business interests, with the complexity of government interests, with the complexity of geopolitics. There's a lot going on. So to me, this is quite, I guess, on one hand, scary. It's on another hand challenging. And then on another hand, it's very exciting, because it means that we have to think of new ways to resolve these problems, which is what we're all currently doing. How might our decision-making processes need to change in order to effectively address these big challenges?
Look, I think it's a good point. I mean, when you said Ben Newell, I know Ben said we should try to make people more future-oriented. I think it's very likely true, because if you think about it, one key difference between the world of a few 1,000 years ago and our world is that time horizons we're facing. Let's take a time machine again and jump 10,000 years ago, and what is the kind of longest time horizons? Already 1 year is very long, right? You may face a 1 year time horizon when you have to think about agricultural decisions, but that's 10,000 years ago. I mean, that would not be even the case, right? So you have to maybe you have to think about building something which is going to last some time, etc. But the time horizon our ancestors would have faced would be very much different than now. Nowadays, you have young people who start their career at 20 who have to think about their retirement options, how much to save for in 40 years, having retirement plans, and you have institutions which kind of allow this to happen. You have banks who, not all the time that we're learning that, from time to time that banks can disappear, but most of the time banks don't disappear, and governments who back your pension scheme usually don't disappear either, or not frequently. And so you have all these institutions and allowing you to trust and to engage in this very long decision-making, long time horizon decision-making. But our psychology clearly was not designed for that. And I think that something we need to appreciate is how how unusual our modern environment is in the history of humanity. If you see that often, if you look at the history of humanity, from 100 million years ago, or not 100 million years ago, so 100,000 years ago to now, or early ancestors to now, you'd find that modern times, which is like basically when people live mostly in urban environment with this kind of long-term horizon, is what, 200 years old in most places, and so this is a very tiny fraction of the history of humanity. And so basically we have these situations where our ancestors and all our psychology has been shaped in environments which have been very, very different, and then was thrown very quickly historically in this radically modern, different environment. And we have to make decisions. And handling these long-term horizons is not something for which, we were talking about the calibration of our utility function or subjective satisfaction. Well, all subjective satisfaction or expected subjective satisfaction is not well calibrated to handle this kind of decisions. And then now I think this naturally leads to the discussions about climate change. Because when you think about climate change, well, you're thinking of time horizons which can potentially be even bigger than, it's more than 40 years. You have to think about maybe the next generation and the generation afterwards, and so that makes it very hard for us to trade off, to make this kind of trade-off. If I tell you, do you want a hot coffee or a hot chocolate? Your kind of decision-making processes are well calibrated to assess what's your preference. But if I tell you, do you want, a bigger car now to do some four-wheel driving in the country, or do you want to vote for a policy which prevents that to happen because that's polluting too much? Our decision-making system is not well designed for us to handle this kind of stuff. And so a risk is that even though if you ask people, and if you ask me, people say, well, obviously I would prefer to be, to make sure that there is no massive climate change with costly evolutions of climate, etc., and which would be incurred by future generation. We may not be very good at acting, kind of implementing policies right now. And pretty much in the same way as, you may want to be fit, but every day you may be eating too much chocolate relative to what you should do, right? So you like the idea of being fit and healthy, but maybe every day you eat a bit too much, or you like the idea of saving money, but every month you spend a bit too much on games, etc., etc. So this kind of problem is always the same, is that we are living with much longer horizons, and we may have an inbuilt preference for now, which means that it's not necessarily that we ignore the fact that some things in the long term needs to be considered, but it's harder for us to properly make decisions when we take that into account and make the right trade-offs in the present.
And I suppose, let's say in some other evolutionary context, for some reason we became very future-oriented, so much so that we're more future-oriented than oriented in short term. I imagine that would pose all sorts of risks to life itself. And so for it to be any other way would potentially not even be possible. So that's at least what I would guess. So, I mean, with that in mind, with this sort of evolutionary challenge with climate being in a potential blind spot, how do you think we can sort of overcome this? How do you think we can overcome this sort of behavioral challenge where we're evolved to be one way, but our existence it requires us to be another way? Is it just a matter of collective action, or what would you say?
Yeah, I'm not sure how much we can change people. That's a good question. I think we need to improve awareness of people about these problems, and to try to transform this awareness in the willingness to act, even if just to, not necessarily to act as a kind of, everybody has to have this kind of feeling of moral duty of saving energy and using electric cars, this kind of more in terms of the willing to act, in terms of when you have to vote for candidates, to kind of require candidates for whom you vote to have this, as part of their platform that they want to implement. So I think I'm not sure we can change, this kind of stuff. I mean, in the same way as it's hard to change the fact that we struggle to go on a diet, we struggle to stop our bad habits. People people before, like 20 years ago, people don't smoke too much anymore, but when people were smoking, they were trying to stop smoking, and they were finding it very hard to stop smoking. Nowadays, people try to stop using their social media account too much, and they hide their iPhone or something like that, and they still get back to it. So this kind of thing is kind of, I'm not sure we can reshape human psychology and avoid that aspect. But I think a key thing is to make people aware of the situation, of the challenges which needs to be addressed. And in that perspective, I think a big thing that is important is to avoid another danger, which is likely to be an impediment to people taking actions, is the fact that these questions nowadays in some countries, they have begun embroiled in terms of very debates between very polarized groups. Okay, so if you look in the US, for instance, you have some groups who's like, climate is very important, if you ignore it, it's terrible. And some others say, well, there's no proof of climate change, etc. And in a very polarized situation, people don't get receptive anymore, because they engage in terms kind of, they belong to groups. It's another kind of this behavior, which I talked about in my book. But if you belong to a group, and if your beliefs is a mark of, of which group you belong to, then you're not here, you're not open anymore to listen to the debate about what's happening in climate change, because if your group says one thing, you want to say the same thing, and you'll be willing to accept much worse arguments if they go alongside with your group, and you're going to be blind, you're going to try to shut your ear and to be much more critical for arguments which come from the other side. And so I think one of the worst things which can happen is for a global issue like climate change, which is key for the planet, to be taken in this kind of wars between groups which are very divided. Because then it is very hard to reach a public consensus. And I think here is part of the duty of the scientists, not to be, I would say it's counterproductive when scientists take sides. And unfortunately, I mean, it's understandable that in the US, most scientists tend to be left-leaning, like everywhere, but at least in the developed world. And during the Trump presidency, I think lots of scientists were inclined to take sides, and
for sure,
I think we can understand. But a consequence of that is that then they can get labeled as one group. And so what means that is their voices, when they try to say something which has to reach all the population, is going to, you're going to convince the people who don't need to be convinced, because they're already in your camp and say yes, yes, yes. And then when you try to reach out, people says, well, we know who you are from the other camp. And so I think key thing is to try really to reach, not to make it not to score political points. I mean, climate change is too important. It's not to engage in the next political election to say that this candidate is bad. I think the scientists should really try to reach everybody, because in the long term, everybody, even people, we individually can disagree politically with, everybody we have a collective shared interest into the world, not going too bad too quickly. So that's the thing I think we can do. Try really to reach out to the people who are skeptical in a neutral way.
Yeah. So if I was just to sort of repeat what you're saying based on what I'm understanding, so to try and rewire evolutionary our evolutionary condition as perhaps not a adventure we should go down to tackle it, and perhaps it's not even possible. But what we can do is to mitigate things that inflame certain /biases /advantages. So, for example, having beliefs that are foundational, making certain sort of issues politicized, and then making them foundational to your identity. So much so that if there's a contradiction, because it's foundational, you no longer want to be receptive to critical engagement. So, so in a strange way, and a fascinating way, we should be very, very careful about politicizing certain issues, any issues really that may be in these blind spots, because it will lead to inaction, which will then lead to the problem becoming worse. Is that a fair summarization?
Well, I think that in the case of climate change, I think yes, I mean, and it's not. I mean, there's a kind of general argument about not doing it in general. Not trying to avoid for the issue to become kind of part of this very kind of short-term political debates, and being on one side, because in that case you're losing a big chunk of people. If you have two parties, you may potentially lose 50% of the population. You want it to be consensual as much as possible, and I guess you want to find the ways of reaching out the people who currently disagree. One risk, and it's natural, it's easy, is that you end up talking to people who agree with you, and perhaps that's one of the risks of social media. For instance, like if I'm not necessarily a scientist, but if I'm a kind of a person reaching an audience, it's easier for me to get a following by saying something that one specific group will like, but that's going to put me in this group. And so the risk is that it divides the space. And so how do we get to the other side? And if it's very polarized, maybe this group wants to hear something very much, but if you deliver that to this group, then you can't reach out and engage the other group.
Yeah, for sure.
That's a challenge. So I would say, how do we talk to people who don't believe in it? How do we engage them respectfully? Because often the risk is that, there's this kind of, we could easily some people go into some kind of condescending attitude, you trust the science, you got people with the PhDs, and you got the people who believe conspiracy theories. And so, but I think you rarely find in history that people are convinced when they are being insulted, or when they are, when they're thinking that it's not an argument, it's a criticism. So how do we reach to people who don't believe in it, and how do we make the case in a kind of consensual way? That's difficult. Maybe not in some countries like Australia, where the political debate is not very conflictual as much as in other countries, but I can see how in some countries like the US it is a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. And I suppose on a last sort of related question on this point, the story that I told at the beginning of the podcast was about, in essence, conspiracy theories, and I said it's irrational, but I think I may sort of step back a second and just say, if there's a group of people that believe in something that has it's threatening their worldview, it makes sense to believe in that, because the alternative is that they fear that whatever their world will collapse, right? So would you say in a sense that it may be rational to believe in things that on a logical basis don't actually make any sense, but from perhaps an emotional point of view, they make complete sense, right? If you feel that for some reason the world is going to end, you will try to group together, do X, Y, and Z to sort of protect your own safety, right? Would you sort of say it's maybe not logical but rational? Would you say that?
Yeah, I would say that. I think it's a very good question you're asking here. Let's take something which is unambiguously wrong, like that. You can take that as a kind of benchmark. where everybody listening would agree. Almost, I guess, 99.9%. Let's consider, people who think that the Earth is flat. So you've got the flat Earth society, and it's a lot of jokes. But you think, like, wait a minute, like, surely you don't believe this kind of stuff. Like, you've got enough people now finding themselves on the internet, and they have a society, and they have conventions, and etc. So now you wonder, how is this possible? What happens with that? And then people invest time, people build arguments about why the Earth is flat, and the evidence that it's wrong is fake, it's NASA is lying to you, etc., etc. So you can wonder how this kind of stuff happens. But what you have to think is that our ability to reason, to argue, to make points was not selected by evolution for us to find the truth. If we want to be very pragmatic, our ability to reason was not selected because our ancestors looked at the sky and were wondering, how the motion in the space happens. What are the laws of nature? And if you were answering these questions better, you were more successful in life. No, people were more successful in life where people were convincing other people, like, be in my team, be in my coalition, join my band, trade with me, do this deal with me, etc. So when you do these kind of discussions, you need to put arguments, join my coalition because we are strong, because we're trustworthy, because we're better than the other, etc. And when you do that, when you have these kind of arguments, you do not act as a scientist, you act as a lawyer. You have a cause, you have an interest, you defend your cause, and you want to put your cause under the best light to convince other people to do the right thing for you. And that's the conditions under which our brains has been selected, like in terms of building reason. So our reasoning ability is tailored for us to act as advocates, as lawyers of what is good for us. Obviously, that means that we need to, we can't be just a lawyer who is going to say anything, because we would not have a good reputation. So there is a kind of need of consistency. And also, not only we need to advocate, but we need to be also on the other side. That is, when somebody advocates, we need to try to pick holes in the arguments. As, wait a minute, you tell me, this is a great opportunity, but I remember last time you said that and it was not, etc. So, you try to find the logical flaws. At the same time, you try to make the base case forward. So you try to be as consistent as possible, but consistency is not your goal. Your goal is conviction. And once you take this view, which is been proposed by Dan Sperber and Hugo, his name is escapes me suddenly, two psychologists. Once you take this view, you understand that that's a feature of what we have. So now you take the flat Earth society. Well, in this microcosm, you have the social space where you can have a higher social status if you bring the best arguments. If you start believing, because you have this strange view that Earth is flat, but now you have a community, you can gain, a standing in the community by being the person who brings the best argument forward, or who debunks or would criticize the opposition argument, etc. And so you have this kind of social competition internally to be the best person in your group. And what you can see in a society like this flat Earth society, you find it everywhere. If you are in a climate change denial situation, it is the same thing. Some people are going to spend a lot of time trying to find the best stories, creating doubts about the fact that climate change is real or climate change is important. And you will get clout in your community by spreading the thing. It's going to be the same thing if you are, for instance, against vaccines. If you can find something which suggests that maybe it's not maybe a very good argument, but people in your community are going to be receptive to it because we're all, the lawyers of this same cause. You're going to gain clout, and you want to believe it, and you sell the story to people who want to believe it. And it's easy to look at this and says, oh yes, it's conspiracy theory. But I think we have to see that the same thing happens if you are in a standard totally mainstream political group. You would have exactly the same thing happening, except that your arguments may be better, and you may have more constraint by the kind of stuff you're going to say. But we have to recognize that a lot of the problems which surface in political debates is because we are not engaged in these political debates as neutral scientists trying to find the truth. We are committed to some groups, and we have social standing depending on our ability to be a good representative of this group. And so, if we are kind of popular in the climate change community and somebody gives us a very good argument against it, well, it's not really in our interest to say, yeah, it's true. And, I should remove myself from this, from being very popular in the climate change community. And so a lot of the debates you have on social media between pundits, they are heavily invested in, being representative of some groups. And so, they won't change their mind easily because that's not really what they are. They are lawyers for their cause, and their cause is very strongly telling them, that's what you should defend. So that's a key problem leading to all this. You look at the debates and say, why are people saying all these weird arguments, etc.? We have to appreciate that it's because we're not designed to have, neutral scientific arguments.
Yeah, just to summarize that, I thought that was brilliant. So, I mean, just to summarize that all, we haven't evolved to seek truth. We've evolved to build tribes and survive, essentially, and seek the best positions in society, which allow us to thrive in a sense. And so I'm sure people that believe in the Flat Earth Society, whoever is the president, he probably feels like the president of the world, or she feels like the president of the world, right? They feel that they're playing an important role. And so to simply dismiss it on the basis of logic is fundamentally missing the point in which people are not seeking truth necessarily. They're seeking, I guess, belonging. They're seeking survival. They're seeking all these sorts of things. Yeah, great, fantastic. Well, look, I think that's a really good place to wrap up, Professor. As a final question, and we asked this to all of our guests, or we tried to at least, I wanted to ask, if you could construct a utopia, your own utopia in the distant future, what would your utopia look like?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I think there's lots of win-win situations to get. I'm going to say something which is not very dreamlike utopia.
Sure.
Maybe because I'm too much of an economist. I think there's a lot of win-win situation. I think one of the frustrating facts that you see is that a lot of the bad situations we're in now, which we could characterize as bad equilibrium, and you could take the same people, and in another history, they could be doing much better. So, in societies, for instance, where people are divided and there's conflicts, the same people in another history, if you're thinking of like multi-world hypothesis, another thing happened in the past and the world moves in a different way, and people will be getting along well in that world, and something else happened in the past and instead people are in conflict. And I think that what you want is to try to find how you bring societies to situations where they're in positive equilibria, where people can cooperate, people can trust in each other, etc. So that's a challenge. And the moment you see a lot of societies which are divided, obviously there's between countries, as a war at the moment in Europe, but within countries as well, according to different lines, etc. And given that we face global challenges, one of the key challenges, how we get people together, how we reduce conflicts. Unfortunately, the political space is not designed to solve this stuff, because people in the political space, their interest is to be elected. And sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes, being divisive or kind of getting a strong support from a very energized minority can be a strategy that you want to follow to gain power. It doesn't necessarily pay to say everybody should be together. Sometimes it's better to be, I'm your guy and our group is right, and they are wrong, and that's going to bring people to the urn voting for you. So I think that's the biggest challenge. And if we could find ways to get societies a bit more peaceful, that'd be great. So I don't know. I don't know how the future will be, but that would be my hope, that we can go towards the situation.
No, I think that's fantastic, and I hope we can. We can be in your utopia as well, because that sounds like a great place. Look, that's everything, Professor. Thank you very much for joining me. If people want to find you, or want to ask you questions, or want to buy your book, where can they find that?
Well, the book is available at Cambridge University Press, so they can Google Optimally Irrational. It's a book written for a broad public. I've tried to be as clear as possible, and it's quite an ambitious book which reviews really the literature in behavioral economics. So if you are interested in behavioral economics, the book is going to review all this literature. So you're going to learn about behavioral economics, but also really with this angle about trying to explain why we behave the way we behave, providing the kind of old and recent explanations. So I think this book really takes a different angle than most of the books in behavioral economics, and I think it's a welcome. I mean, it's easy to say that it's my book, but I think it's a welcome book in the current times.
I can say that for you. It's a welcome change. There you go.
Thank you. Well, I think people are looking now for, we have had like 20 years of behavioral economics now, which is being popular for quite some time. So people are looking for, okay, we take that people don't behave like the old models, but what, why? And so I think the book kind of provides this kind of, what is the next step of behavioral science? So this book, if you're interested, by all means, check it out. And then otherwise, if people are interested to follow me, I'm often on tweeting stuff on Twitter. I'm trying to contribute positively to the public interactions on Twitter, trying along the lines of what I've said in this podcast. So obviously people are much welcome to find me there.
Fantastic. Well, stay with me in the green room, Lionel, but thank you for joining me.
Thank you. Thank you, Xavier.